Welcome to Module 3, Challenges of Managing Common Resources. The image you see, a vast and fertile landscape, perfectly captures the promise of our shared natural wealth. These resources, pastures, fisheries, clean air, and water, are essential for our survival and prosperity, yet their shared nature presents a profound challenge. In this module, we will be focusing on several key learning goals to give you a comprehensive understanding of the challenges surrounding common resources. More importantly, we will chart a path toward solutions, examining how collective action can help us sustainably manage well the vital resources we all depend on. This journey will take us from classic parables to modern economic theory, and finally, to practical, real-world solutions that communities are using today to overcome this fundamental dilemma. Let's begin. First, we will establish a clear framework by learning the four distinct categories of goods. Understanding these categories is crucial for diagnosing why certain resources are prone to overuse. Second, we will dive deep into two pivotal concepts: the tragedy of the commons and the prisoner's dilemma. These powerful models will help us understand the underlying logic that drives the depletion of shared resources and the breakdown of cooperation. Third, we will connect these theories to the real world, exploring how the tragedy of the commons is directly relevant to both global and local environmental problems, from overfishing in our oceans to air pollution in our cities. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, we will shift our focus to solutions. We will analyze different approaches and coordination mechanisms that can be used to solve these complex social dilemmas, empowering communities to manage their resources sustainably for the long term. To begin our exploration, let's turn to the classic parable that gives this problem its name: the story of a shared pasture. Imagine a pasture that is open to all local farmers. The area of this land is fixed, but the number of livestock that can graze upon it is variable. In this scenario, each farmer, acting in their own rational self-interest, considers only their private costs and benefits. They think, if I add one more animal to my herd, I will gain all the profit from that animal, while the cost of the slightly increased grazing is shared among all the farmers. The logic is compelling for each individual. The problem is that every farmer makes the same calculation. As each farmer adds more and more animals to maximize their personal gain, the collective result is a disaster. The pasture becomes overgrazed, its quality is severely reduced for everyone, and the shared resource that supported the entire community is ultimately destroyed. As the images here illustrate, what begins as sustainable use descends into tragedy. This story perfectly encapsulates the core paradox we are studying. A series of rational individual choices can lead to a deeply irrational and destructive collective outcome. To properly analyze this problem, economists classify all goods based on two key characteristics: excludability and rivalry. A good is excludable if people can be prevented from using it. For example, you can't enter a cinema without a ticket. A good is rivalrous if one person's use of it diminishes another person's ability to use it. If I eat an apple, you cannot eat that same apple. This 2 by 2 matrix gives us four categories. In the top left, we have private goods like food and cars, which are both excludable and rivalrous. In the bottom left are club goods, such as cinemas or private parks, which are excludable but non-rivalrous. The dilemma truly begins on the right side of this chart, with goods that are non-excludable, where access is open to all. Here we find public goods, like clean air or national defense. And critically, In the top right, we have common goods, also known as common pool resources. These are the goods at the heart of our pasture story. Like public goods, they are non-excludable, but like private goods, they are highly rivalrous. Fish stocks, timber, and nature reserves are classic examples. By catching a fish means there is one less fish for you to catch. It is this combination of open access and resource depletion that creates the conditions for the tragedy of the commons. Now, let's examine this problem through the lens of a classic supply and demand diagram to understand the economic consequences. The downward sloping demand curve represents the private benefits each farmer gets from adding more animals. The lower, upward sloping supply curve is based only on the private costs, the direct expenses each farmer incurs for their own animals. When users only consider these private costs and benefits, the market settles at an equilibrium point labeled Q market. This results in a high quantity of animals on the pasture. However, this calculation dangerously ignores the social costs, the damage done to the shared resource by each additional animal, a cost that is borne by the entire community. If we factor in these social costs, the true supply curve is higher. The optimal quantity of animals for the long-term health of the community, labeled Q-opt, is therefore much lower, at a higher corresponding price. The difference between the market outcome and the optimal outcome results in a welfare loss for society, represented by the shaded orange triangle. This area represents the net value and well-being that is destroyed when a common resource is overused due to a failure to account for shared social costs. This is a classic example of market failure. A closely related challenge, especially concerning public goods, is the free rider problem. As the slide asks, why pay if you don't have to? The simple question gets to the heart of the issue. Consider a public good like clean air. While it would be in everyone's collective interest to maintain it, there is very little incentive at the individual level to contribute. In the words of economist Mancor Olson, why should any single person or group go to the effort of reducing pollution if they know that others will continue to pollute? And conversely, why not benefit from the efforts of others to reduce pollution without making any contribution yourself? This is known as free riding. The illustration here depicts it perfectly. Several people contribute to a clean air fund, while another individual simply walks by, enjoying the benefits without paying the cost. This poses a serious problem because if everyone can access or use public goods without contributing, these goods will likely be underproduced, overused, or degraded. The outcome is strikingly similar to the tragedy of the commons, a collective failure born from individual incentives. To further illustrate why cooperation often breaks down even when it's in our collective best interest, let's turn to a famous example from game theory, the prisoner's dilemma. The setup is straightforward. Two prisoners are accused of a string of crimes and are being interrogated in separate rooms. They cannot communicate with each other. The interrogator presents them with a set of stakes. If both prisoners confess to the crime, they will each serve 6 years in prison. If neither confesses, the evidence is weak, and they will both serve only 1 year. However, here is the twist. If only one prisoner confesses and testifies against the other, the confessor goes free as a key witness, while the prisoner who remains silent receives a harsh 10-year sentence. The game forces each prisoner to consider their best strategy, independent of the other's action. Let's map up the choices in the prisoner's dilemma to understand the most likely outcome. We'll follow the logic step by step. First, consider the choice from prisoner 1's perspective. They don't know what prisoner 2 will do, so they must consider both possibilities. If prisoner 2 confesses, prisoner one's best move is also to confess, as 6 years is better than 10. Now, what if prisoner 2 lies and stays silent? Prisoner one's best move is still to confess, because going free is better than serving 1 year. So, no matter what the other person does, confessing is always the better option for prisoner 1. This is their dominant strategy. Second, because the situation is identical for both prisoners, the exact same logic applies to prisoner 2. Confessing is also their dominant strategy. This leads us to the third and final outcome. Both prisoners, following their own rational self-interest, will confess. They land in the top left box, each receiving a 6-year sentence for a total of 12 years in prison. But notice the box in the bottom right. The best collective result, only 2 total years in prison, is unreachable through individual rational choice alone. It requires a level of trust and cooperation that the structure of the dilemma is designed to break. This brings us full circle, connecting the abstract game of the prisoners back to the tangible problem of the pasture. The cold calculating logic that traps the prisoners is the very same engine that drives the tragedy of the commons. As one of our key texts states, in exactly the same way, although it is optimal for individual livestock farmers to keep as many cattle as possible on the common pasture, this does not lead to an optimal result from a collective point of view. The Nobel Prize-winning political economist Elinor Ostrom, who dedicated her life's work to this issue, provided a powerful and concise definition for this entire class of problems. She called it the social dilemma. In her words, social dilemmas occur whenever individuals in interdependent situations face choices in which the maximization of short-term self-interest yields outcomes leaving all participants worse off than feasible alternatives. This single sentence perfectly captures the essence of the challenge, whether it applies to prisoners in separate rooms, fishermen at sea, or nations dealing with climate change. It is the fundamental conflict between short-term individual gain and long-term collective well-being. So, if relying on individual rationality consistently leads to these suboptimal and often destructive outcomes, what is the alternative? How do we escape the trap of the social dilemma? The only way to cope with these challenges is to coordinate individual activities. We must find ways to align individual incentives with the collective good. The literature on this topic outlines 3 primary mechanisms for achieving this essential coordination. The first is the market, relying on price signals and economic incentives to guide behavior. The second is the state, which uses its authority to create and enforce laws and regulations. And the third, a path strongly advocated by Elinor Ostrom, is self-organization. This is a bottom-up approach where communities themselves come together to create, monitor, and enforce their own rules for managing shared resources. Let's break down these 3 coordination mechanisms for achieving sustainable management.
First, we have the market. The coordinating force here is entrepreneurial spirit and the pursuit of profit.
The primary instruments used are market signals and prices. A key goal is to ensure that all costs, including social and environmental ones, are reflected in the price of goods. A great example of this approach is the development of fair trade products, which use market mechanisms to reward more sustainable and ethical production practices. Second is the state. Here, coordination is achieved through power and political processes. The state's role is to internalize external costs, for example, by implementing a carbon tax to make polluters pay for the damage they cause. Its instruments are economic incentives, like subsidies for green technology, and regulations, such as legislation that sets limits on fishing or pollution. Finally, we have self-organization. This path is coordinated by a community's shared ambition to maintain their livelihoods and resources. The instruments are not imposed from the outside, but are rules created by the community itself. Classic examples include shared property arrangements and local land, water, or fishing communities that have successfully managed their resources for generations by developing their own systems of governance. For a long time, economists argued there were only two ways to solve the tragedy of the commons: the state, or top down regulation. The government steps in and makes rules. They tell you how many fish you can catch or how much CO2 you can emit. They use command and control tactics, monitoring and punishing those who break the rules. While effective, this can be very expensive and slow, and it often fails if the government is corrupt or lacks the resources to monitor everyone. The market or privatization. This involves turning the common good into a private good. If you divide the pasture into small fenced-off plots, each farmer now owns their land. Suddenly, it is in their own self-interest to take care of it, because if they overgraze, they are the only ones who suffer. This is the logic behind individual transferable quotas in fishing. However, many resources like the atmosphere or the open ocean simply cannot be fenced off. You can't privatize the air. This led many to believe the tragedy was unavoidable for global resources. But then a political scientist named Elinor Ostrom discovered a third way that changed everything. To see just how powerful the self-organization approach can be, let's look at a fantastic real-world example: community-supported agriculture, or CSA. In a CSA model, food is no longer just a product sold on the market. Instead, producers and consumers come together to form a direct economic community, bypassing the pressures that can lead to unsustainable practices. Here's how it works. A group of local households agrees to pay a fixed amount to a farm in advance for an entire year. This provides the farmer with financial security and allows them to plan and grow food according to actual demand, without the pressure to cut corners for market competition. The result is transformative. The producer can focus on good agricultural practices, keeping the soil fertile and promoting biodiversity. In return, the buyers receive the entire harvest, fresh, local food produced with care. This personal connection makes everyone aware of their mutual responsibility. It's a prime example of a community defining its own rules to escape a dilemma, creating a system that fosters social coexistence, nature conservation, and truly sustainable agriculture. We have reached the end of our exploration into the challenges of managing common resources. Let's recap. We learned that common goods are difficult to manage because they are non-excludable, but rivalrous. We saw how the tragedy of the commons and the prisoner's dilemma explain why rational individuals often make choices that destroy the resources we all depend on. We discussed the problem of free riding and why large groups struggle to cooperate. But most importantly, we learned that we have tools to fight back, whether through smart regulation, privatization where appropriate, or self-organization as championed by Elinor Ostrom. We can redesign our social operating system to favor sustainability. My call to action for you today is this. Think about a commons in your own life. It could be the shared kitchen in your office, a local park, or even a professional network. Is it being overused? Is there a free rider problem? How could you apply Ostrom's principles to make it more sustainable?